you can identify people with the potential for leadership, and you can then develop it. Most of the good ideas in an organization will come from the people who do the work. Beginning, if the communication was better, that would have been a big start.
Welcome to The Conversation. In today's episode of Trailblazers, Johnny is speaking to Colonel Bob Pearce, MBE, author and expert in strategic planning and leadership.
Well, Bob, an absolute pleasure to have you here, sir. I thought I'd kick off actually a little bit differently to how I usually do with these things and give you a bit of a note of thanks, actually, because after reading your book, I have to say, I think it's one of the most invaluable resources for anyone that's seeking a leadership position. And it actually extends beyond that. I think many of us know the types of leaders that we are looking towards and that we would like to have. And I think that your, lessons in this book actually work on both sides for those seeking to lead and also those who will be led. What was it that prompted you to write a book on leadership, and tell us a little bit about your journey up into to this point?
Well, firstly, thank you very much. That's a lovely thing to say about the book, and it's really nice to hear because writing a book is not easy. It takes a lot of time, and I didn't actually set out to write a book. I sort of found myself writing it. I spent a long time in the army. I joined when I was 16 and I left a good number of years later. I joined as an apprentice at 16 and I left as a colonel in 2014. And I left and joined the National Health Service on a leadership program. And I suppose that's whilst leadership, and I'll probably come to that, but whilst leadership is something that the Army focuses on a great deal, my own personal reflections sort of started then when I was on the program and we were trying to tackle various challenges. The program was about reimagining healthcare. It was a 9-month-long program, and it started with the first month at Harvard in America, at the university, learning about the theory of implementing change in healthcare situations. And that program, with the others on the program, there are 50 people on the program, led me to start telling stories. And we all do this. I think we all do this. If there's something that happens in my life, I start telling you about it, and you sort of think the same sort of thing. So I tell you that I was delayed at the airport when I was going on holiday, and I start telling you about it, and your mind, I think they call it narrative resonance or something, but your mind starts thinking of when you were delayed on a holiday, and you can't sort of wait to come and chip in as part of that discussion and tell me, oh yes, the same thing happened to me. So I was using these illustrations to say we were faced with a problem on this program. This is how I've done it in the past. And it started making me think about the fact that there were quite a lot of potential lessons that I was using to illustrate, overcoming these problems. And I started writing them down because I was using them again. And the long story short is it became a book, but it took a long time for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it's an absolutely sensational resource. And I, going through it, found so many situations in which the items that you described could be applied in all manner of different settings, not just from the army obviously with your experience in the NHS, and I think all walks of life, including obviously like ourselves, the design agency world. Is there a particular lesson that stands out, that, or a phrase that I suppose best encapsulates leadership for you?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult one. I think that there's quite a lot of discussion, academic research into leadership. One of the big things is the difference between leadership and management. And I sense that where I'm coming from in the book is that leadership is very important. But a lot of organizations look at management, value management, and it has a place. And my sense is that management is about resources, things, making things, accounting for things, efficiency in the organization, whereas leadership is about people. Leadership is about inspiring people to do those things. In the army, right at the very beginning, I said I joined when I was 16. I went off to the regular careers, regular commissioning board, the RCB. It's called the Army Officers Selection Board nowadays, to go through a process to see whether I could go to Sandhurst. And at that couple of days, they go through some tests. They go through academic tests. You write essays. You give a presentation. You have to talk about your understanding of current affairs. They ask you what newspapers you read. You have to do some physical tests. Get across the shark-infested gap with a plank and a piece of string. And you do all those things, but actually what they're looking for, because most people that are doing this quite young. I was just 17 and a half. People nowadays go there post-university generally. Most officers are post-university nowadays. But they're still young and I would say inexperienced, largely inexperienced. But what they look for there is leadership potential. The ticket to get into Sandhurst is that they have identified some form of leadership potential. And my sense is that other organizations maybe don't have the privilege of selecting people and having them work through the whole of their career in that one organization. But equally, as you said, these lessons transfer. And my sense is that in some organizations, and since leaving the army, I've noted this, the value is placed more on knowledge of the organization, experience in the organization, time served in the organization, rather than leadership potential or leadership qualities. And I think there is a difference. And I think sometimes we end up with very good managers in leadership positions. And I think to a point, we set them up for failure. We set them up to struggle because we've put them into a leadership position because they're good at what they do rather than being good at inspiring other people to do, which is where I'm coming from.
It's the classic thing of when you have a massively competent individual contributor in an organization who finds themselves being promoted to management of teams and responsibility that they don't really want, and they're probably not overly qualified for because they've never developed the skills and never been given the skills or the training to develop those skills. And that actually leads me on to the next question, which is leadership an innate quality of certain individuals? As you mentioned, and it strikes me as, incredible that at 16 and 17 and a half, in your instance, that there were individuals going to Sandhurst and being evaluated on having some of those qualities. that would have that potential. Is leadership something that's just innate to individuals, particular individuals, or can it be developed and nurtured?
Yeah. So my feeling is that leadership is absolutely something that people should think about very early on. I've written this book and I've given a few talks to schools, and I say to youngsters in schools, some as young as year 9, that they should be thinking about leadership. They should, because they're already doing it. You know, they're leading their sports teams, their little groups, their charity group, whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah.
And if you look in a business, across the whole business, there are leaders. There's not just the chief executive. There are leaders in all sorts of departments or small parts of that organization, and leadership is needed in all these areas. And leadership is certainly needed before you become the leader. So my argument is that leadership needs to be thought about all the time and as early as you can. But to answer your specific question about, are people born leaders? I'm sure some are. And one of the things that inspired me to write the book was that I wanted to I felt I had a book about an ordinary person, a 16-year-old that joined the army as an apprentice chef. So not somebody who was the son of a general who was going to be a general, and I'm not saying they all do. But what I mean is that I think that at the Officers Selection Board and elsewhere in other sectors, you can identify people with the potential for leadership and you can then develop it. And I think that people, whatever position they are in an organization, should think of continuous professional development, to use the phrase. We can all learn and get better if we're interested in the subject. Somebody asked me a while ago, you seem quite interested in leadership. When did that start? And I said, it's always been something I've interested in. I've always been interested in the business of what motivates people and how can I motivate people to do something. So I think that we can all get better at it. And those that are in privileged positions to lead should still be studying it. It's not something that finishes just because you get promoted to that job or that role.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's so many opportunities for learning as you grow as a leader, because there will be different styles, there'll be different levers that you need to pull in order to motivate your team, and that process is never truly done, because you may have immense cognitive diversity in your team, which means that what one member of staff responds to, another may not. And so you constantly need to be adapting and being flexible in your style. But with that, I also wanted to touch on something that I absolutely loved in this book, which was when you'd set your intent to your team and you'd written this lovely letter and communicated very, very clearly what you expected of your team. And I think one of the things that is so often missed is that level of communication about expectations, both from the leader downward, but also the opening of the door to go bottom up. And actually for those staff to be able to say, for those members of that team to be able to say what their understanding of the expectations are, and then reaching that agreement together. How important for you is expectation setting, communication of intent, and starting off on the right foot with your team?
Yeah, I mean, and again, thank you for reading all the way through. The letters are at the end, aren't they?
I told you, absolutely loved it. I think there's so much gold in here. I'm actually going to be giving my team a copy because I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's such a treasure trove of information.
It really is interesting. One of the things that I that you're highlighting there is the business of communication. And I certainly talk about the fact that as a leader, whatever organization we're in, we need to understand that we don't do everything. We can't do everything. And actually, much of what we might do might not be as good as some of those people that we're working with. Our job is to inspire and facilitate and enable people to do their best. And I think that's why there's that fundamental difference between leadership and management, where management is this is how you do it, and then you repeat it. Whereas enabling people to do their best is a fascinating experience, to see people doing things in a different way to how you might have imagined it would happen, and find it's actually better. And I think if people feel comfortable, then they will be able to do that. Comfortable, there's lots written and said about making mistakes, learning organizations. The health service talks a lot about being a learning organization and enabling people to learn. But I think one of the issues to make people feel comfortable is the business of, firstly, the example. As a leader, you set the standard, the values and standards of the organization. The things you do, the things you say are all noted. One of the things I mention is that you're a leader all the time. You're not just a leader 9 till 5 when you're in the office. People will see what you do. People will hear what you've done or what you've said. And that conveys a message with regard to whether or not they feel comfortable. I talk about it being the commanding officer in the regiment and walking down the corridor from my office to go and make a cup of tea, and hearing somebody in an office talking to someone and saying the commanding officer wouldn't be happy with that. Or going past another office and hearing somebody on the phone saying, yes, you can do that. The commanding officer would be happy with that. And people are, that leadership is a thread that goes through the organization, but it's an understanding. I remember there was I don't think this is in the book. There was an incident in the sergeant's mess, and there'd been a bit of aggravation, and there was a discussion about whether the commanding officer should be informed of this fight the next morning, and eventually the discussion came to, if we don't tell him about it, he will be upset about the fact we've concealed it. If we do tell him about it, we can deal with it, and he will deal with it in a very practical way. But hiding it will be the crime, not the fact. I meant it was almost 2 regiments. It was 1,200 soldiers. I can't be in a position, and many of us in whatever leadership positions we're in, however big or small the organization is, you can't have your finger on everything, and nor indeed would you want to. As I say, that is that freedom to make decisions that enables people to be creative.
Yeah, absolutely. You spoke about standards there previously, and there's this lovely little quote from Lieutenant General David Morrison, which is, the standards you walk past are the standards you accept. And exactly what you were alluding to there, I truly believe that is what you say and do is, as a leader, interpreted by everyone as the standard that is set for the entire organization. And I think that's something that's very often missed on the path upward. And as you mentioned, with those people who find themselves in a position where they are promoted upward as kind of really more management than leaders, I think that's a very noticeable part of the quality that's lacking there, is that clear communication of intent, expectation, standard setting, and acceptance of that. You mentioned also that the cost of leadership is self-interest. And I think these two tessellate quite nicely in that you set those standards But obviously, what you are setting is also you have to have an acceptance of, you have to put yourself last almost. Your leadership is such. I think Simon Sinek has this "Leaders Eat Last" is one of his books, and I think a lot of the time people forget that. Would you like to expand a little bit more on what you mean by the cost of leadership is self-interest?
Yeah, and it's very interesting you highlight Simon Sinek's book, because I think that's a great summary of where the military come from, and a lot of his examples, of course, are American, but the American military, the British military, some of these standards, many of these standards are the same, and the leaders eat last is something that you don't even realize. As an officer in the army, you never go to the front of the queue. You just don't, and you don't even know when you learned that, because your interest is in your soldiers. Your interest is to make sure that the soldiers are supported and provided for, whatever it is you're doing in that example. And that really does have to come first. I think the idea of finding yourself at the back of the queue is almost something that hasn't been conscious. The reason it isn't is because your motivation is to look after the troops and make sure that your troops are have what they need in order to do what it is that you're encouraging them to do. And I think that idea of selfless commitment is one of the values and standards of the British Army, and that idea that as a leader you must make sure that you can do everything in your power to enable those that are working in your team to deliver what they need to, is something that's sort of ingrained. And just to go back to the point that you put at the beginning very kindly, is that the idea of the book was to say, these are lessons I learned in the army that I think can transfer to all sorts of different sectors. And the illustrations were to say, this is how it was. And if you think about this in your environment, it will apply. And fundamentals like this really do apply. And I must admit, sometimes I can see in a different environment where people go, well, this chap hasn't done something, or that person hasn't thought of something, and here are the troops not being able to do it. And I can't say it's always gone well in the military, but the approach is there. And as you highlight the American general's quote, which was a fascinating one, because that goes back to this business of example. And where I'm coming from is you've already set the example because you're in the chair. But I suppose what you need to do is be comfortable with it. If you are trying to be something, they say this, don't they, when you're going for interviews? If you don't get the job, it's probably because you were not the right fit for that organization. If you try and become that round peg in a square hole, if you say something that's not appropriate, or it's not from your heart, because you know it will get you the job, then you've got to try and pretend the whole time, and you will fall over. And I think that's when I say about, as an individual, as a leader, that you end up having to think about others first all the time. But I suspect you're naturally doing that. It's not something that you have to say, oh, right, now I've got this job, I'll have to do that. Which is why it goes back to my point, I suppose, that leadership is something that we should be thinking about. We should be growing leaders. We have the privilege in the military of growing people. I went to Sandhurst as quite a young person, and throughout my career, we were talking about, reading about, practicing leadership. And so the whole of that time was thinking about leadership. And then I see in other organizations where, as we've said earlier, people find themselves in a leadership position. And what I'm trying to say is prepare yourself. Think about leadership before you get there, and you might be better prepared when you get there.
Absolutely. And I think you've really touched on something there that I wanted to talk to you about, which was, obviously you've spent time in the army and then you've gone over to the NHS. What are some of the qualities of leadership in the army that you find most applicable, that you think organizations like the NHS might benefit from the most? Because I think with that lens on things, I think, there's clearly the NHS doesn't necessarily function as one single entity. It is, this collection of different moving parts. How does one reconcile that and, equip those people? What are the most applicable qualities, I suppose, that you would instill to ensure effective the effectiveness of that organization?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I noticed when I moved into the health service, I'm not in the health service now, but when I did, was that the military have a rotating sort of program. So we deployed in that instance that I was talking about to Iraq for 6 months or so, and then we came back and we had some downtime, we had some recovery time, we then had some training time, and then in fact before I left the unit, a tour as a commanding officer was 2.5 years, and before I left we were preparing to go again, but we had that curve of activity. In the health service, it's not quite like that. So if you are working in the emergency department, every day you go into the emergency department and it's overflowing, the ambulances are waiting, and there's no beds for people, and it's every day. And so I think one of the things that I tried to make sure was that it wasn't the same person every day in the same place just being battered. And try and make sure that even though the time frame might be different, so it might be a couple of days instead of a few weeks or whatever, that there was still an ebb and flow for people to recover and recharge their batteries. But it's not something, the NHS is on ops all the time, and so the people need to be able to be given the time, and that's a challenge when you're working in an organization and you haven't got all the people you need. So one of the things to do is to look at that structure. How many people you need? Can you do it differently? Can you do it such that people get some downtime? And I think sometimes we in the army we don't do this. I think the rest and recuperation is something that we know people need, and we give time and effort and money to it. I think sometimes in other organizations we don't see that. So we have in the military, we look at the when you deploy, you are responsible for everything that person does. So they don't finish their day job and then go home. They finish their day job and you're responsible for their home or for what they're dealing with. In the health service, they do go home. You're not responsible after they finish work, and I think that is a change. And I think sometimes we find that we don't know enough about people. I tell the story of being asked the question when I was a young officer about my troop sergeant. and my OC, the major, was asking me, I was a lieutenant, and asked me about the troop sergeant. I said, I know everything about the troop sergeant. He's done these courses. He's been on these tours. He does all these things, da, 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 da. And the guy said to me, how many children has he got? I was stumped. I had no idea. And he was illustrating that lesson. And if you ask that question as a leader of people that are in leadership positions in your organization, what do they know about their people? If they only know the professional piece, then they don't know the half of it. Ronnie Heifetz, the professor in Harvard, did a little sketch when we were over there. He did a little sketch on the blackboard, and he just drew a circle, and he drew a little sort of arrowhead into the circle, and then he drew some more all the way round, and he just said this arrowhead represents people involved in this change activity that you're talking about. The point of the arrowhead was in the circle, but a large part of that arrowhead shape, that little triangle, wasn't in the circle. He said that's the rest of the person. That's the part of the person that's thinking about picking the children up or doing the shopping or getting the car serviced or whatever it is. And we have to understand when we're trying to get people in the middle of that circle to do something, that there's more to them. And in order to have them properly focused, sometimes we have to understand what those other pressures are and react to those as well. And maybe in the army we have that privilege, because when you're deployed on operations, they probably don't have much outside the circle. They have to eat and sleep, clean their weapon, maintain their vehicle, piece of equipment, whatever it is, and then they're on. Whereas people in other sectors have a whole host of things stressing them, and leaders need to probably understand that and know that there's a pressure on this individual, and they might not be firing on all cylinders that day.
Yeah, and that's a really, really beautiful perspective to be able to put on things, in terms of, as you say, within the army, your focus is clear. You have that 6-month deployment. You don't really have much else. The focus is on your immediate duties then and there, without the outside distraction. And within the world that we have with our NHS workers and the people in those systems, they will be there for their shift, and then after that they'll go home and they have to pick up the kids and they have to think about dinner and they have to do their laundry, they have to take care of a loved one, maybe they have to do this and this and this and this and this, and all of that's just cognitive load on the individual. And I think that's a really useful lens to put on things when, as leaders inside that organization, you should be looking after the individuals that are a part of it as your priority. And I suppose that there's a certain element of something else that you mentioned here, which is to treat people as you would wish to be treated yourself, and to allow that grace and time for them in those circumstances.
Yeah, I think the term used nowadays is emotional intelligence, but I do think that and my intention in the book was to capture illustrations of how I did things sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and to be able to say to people, if you're in a similar circumstance, this is what happened to me. It's not necessarily the right way, but here's another way of thinking about it. And it was certainly when I was asked that question by my OC as to whether or not I understood enough about my platoon sergeant, that it was quite clear that my emotional intelligence at that stage wasn't as strong as it ought to be. But in other circumstances, and certainly later in life, and that's why I've tried to capture it, it's been really, really important. One very short illustration is that we were deployed. We were in Kuwait before we were going to move into Iraq, so we were doing all the preparation. And I had a call from my regiment was based in Germany, a call from Germany to say that the wife of one of the senior warrant officers working for me, she was pregnant, and there was some concern that she might lose the child. I called the chap in to say that I had been made aware of this, and he was aware of it. Now we were on the point of preparing for and going to war. So the things that we train for our whole lives in the army, and not all of us do it, and certainly, very few people are in the privileged position to be a commanding officer in that sort of circumstance. But I was sat there talking to this chap, and he knew he had a job to do. He'd been trained to do the job. He was leading soldiers as part of the regiment. And I told him that he was going home, and he was going on a flight, and there was plenty of flights. There was lots of stores being brought in and people being brought into the country. There was lots of empty flights going home. So getting him a flight home was easy. And I said, and you're going this afternoon, you've got an hour, pack up, and most stuff is in one rucksack anyway. And off you go. Now his professional view was that he should be where his troops were and what he'd been trained to do. And my view of his wider life was actually, because he said to me, if she loses the child, I'll go back. And I said, she needs you now, not then. And then probably. He went back, things calmed down a bit. He got himself back out and before we deployed, and all was well. And he came to me and thanked me for making him go home, because he could not have made that decision. He wasn't able to make that decision. Now, I'm not saying that in all circumstances I've had the emotional intelligence to make the right call, but I think that what we should try and do as leaders is put ourselves in the shoes of those other people. Now, you can only do that if you understand what's going on in their lives. Now, not prying, and you don't need to know everything. And certainly in those circumstances, I knew something quite personal about somebody that you probably wouldn't know in circumstances elsewhere in other employments. But it was an example of trying to understand how people felt. Something that I talked about in the book was where I was being posted somewhere, and there was a bit of pressure on me from a family perspective, and they were trying to change the posting, and I was at home, and I had a big discussion, and I had to go in and tell them this wasn't right. So I had a list of things. You may have read this. I had a list of things on my paper that I was going to tell the boss, and I made an appointment, and I sat down, and he said, "You've come to see me because you said there was an issue over your posting. I imagine that you've booked all your the movement planning. You've sold your car. Your children have changed the schools." And I'm thinking, he's got my list, And he, in effect, read through my list before I said anything. He already had it because he had thought those things through. And I try and suggest that when somebody is coming in to see you about something, or maybe when you've asked them to come and see you, like I did with the warrant officer, he didn't volunteer to come in. If you've taken the time to try and put yourself in their shoes, then you can probably come up with most often the right action, the right thing to do in those circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's ability to step back and see the broader picture as well, and not be so in the detail of the particular task at hand is a really important quality that you have there. And that, in that particular instance with the chap with the pregnant wife, he didn't want to let her down, but equally he doesn't want to let his team down. He can't detach himself sufficiently from the immediate need of his team to then say, okay, maybe I do need to, be where I need to be with my family and stuff like that. And I think that's a really important quality that leaders should have as well in the assessment of the picture as a whole, not just the immediate task at hand, which I know obviously is something else in the book that you speak about, and that ability to calmly assess a situation and then take appropriate action as and when it's necessary. We touched a little bit on the NHS there. Are there any things in particular that you think could lead to or have a hand in the ability of those individuals to maybe get some of that recovery time, whether that be technology, whether that be digital tech or things like that? Because it seems like that's a really valuable piece to the Army experience, where you're actually able to have that time out, where you're able to actually get a semblance of a broader picture, of a wider picture that doesn't necessarily just batter you, as you said quite rightly, day in, day out, day in, day out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've got the solution, but I do know from the experience that we had going through that program in America, and thinking through how to do things differently. One of the big things that we do in the military is contingency planning, and we're forever writing contingency plans. I remember being in a job where I was responsible for, it was a NATO job, and I was responsible for the logistics. I was a logistics officer in the Army, the logistics for deployments to the NATO flanks. And there are NATO deployment plans. And what we had to do was write contingency plans. So if the assumptions in the plan A weren't there and there was a slight change, what would we do? And we have plan B and we have plan C. And I spent my whole life, because you can never stop with contingency planning. But I think one of the aspects that leadership brings and management probably doesn't, and this is where I see the value of leadership, I think, opposed to management or managers, good managers being put into leadership positions, is that testing, that questioning, that reviewing type approach. So one of the things that I recall in the health service was the pressures on the hospital. I talked about the emergency department and the ambulances waiting outside and flow through the hospital not working. And we've seen some recent changes, and CCGs becoming ICBs, and trying to join the organization together better. And I think that's a move in the right direction. I think it hasn't quite gone far enough yet, but I know the intent is there. And I remember talking about that when I was working there. But in the Army, the organizations, when they're deployed, are working as a coherent whole, because there is a chain of command. There's a structure. So if you're in a regiment, you're working within a brigade, and your brigade's working within a division, and there is somebody who is in charge of all of that. In the health service, I think there are air gaps between the organizations. One of the things that we talk about in the Army is when you look at two organizations being deployed. If you imagine they're deployed in defense, then they have overlapping arcs of fire. So the two organizations that border each other, two different organizations, let's say two regiments, are deployed. There isn't a straight line that we defend everything here and you defend everything there. We have overlapping arcs of fire. So our arcs of fire will cross the line and your arcs of fire will cross the line. So the bit in the middle, instead of having a gap, actually has twice the firepower. Now, what happens in the health service is you have an acute trust, and it has ambulances trying to get in the front end. And in order to flow through the hospital, you need to discharge some patients to home, but you need to discharge other patients to other organizations, a community hospital, whatever it is, a care home. And they don't have overlapping arcs of fire, overlapping responsibility. They have straight lines. No, I'm responsible for this bit. You're responsible for that bit. And as a consequence, there is actually the potential for a gap between those, an air gap between those organizations rather than an overlap. And my view is that, and I did this with one of the projects that I ran in the hospital while I was there, looking at discharging respiratory patients. And they used to be discharged from the acute hospital and go through a whole process, get assessed and decide when they were going to be discharged. They were discharged to the community, either home or into a community hospital, but they then became the responsibility of the community respiratory organization. And they had a visit from the community nurse. And every patient that was discharged had a visit from the community nurse. A good element of them, I don't recall the figure, let's call it 40% of the people who had a visit, it was a big number, had a visit to confirm that they needed no more support. And what I did was say, can we get the community nurse to come to the board round in the acute trust when the discussion about that patient and that patient's discharge is done, and make the determination there and then as to whether or not they need a visit from a community nurse the next day when they're in the community. And that saved, you can imagine, that saved a whole lot of time, because the nurse didn't have to go and visit because he or she had been at the board round. And if the discussion had been about 10 patients, that's 10 visits that didn't have to, or 40% of 10 visits that didn't have to happen. Whatever it was a saving because of the overlap wasn't doubling, it was saving.
Well, it compounds, doesn't it?
And that's where I was.
Yeah, the benefit of that is like compounding interest, where you've got that simple moving of that structure where that person is in that board meeting. All of a sudden, as you say, that's 10 times the impact that person has, because they can have that discussion then and there. It's so much more effective than going to each individual person's house and dealing with it that way.
And just to touch on your technology piece, when I was doing that, and it was a few years ago, the computer system that the community organization used and the computer system that the acute trust used did not talk to each other. So in order to do this trial, I had to provide computers from the trust to the community. This was different computers with different access and all of that. Whereas actually, if going back to the point we made right at the beginning, if the communication was better, that would have been a big start. If they could just communicate with each other rather than wait until they arrived.
Absolutely. What are the ways in which we tackle situations that we perceive and understand to not be ideal without making matters worse? So obviously one of the things to be mindful of in criticism, I suppose, is the word that you might use most frequently, is how do we draw something to someone's attention in a proactive manner that then doesn't lead to insubordination, insidious elements, and basically compounding the situation to make it worse? What's the best way to go about facilitating those changes, as you did there with that situation with the home visits, for example?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is to try and make sure that everybody has the same aim, the same vision. the same mission, whatever we want to call it, an understanding of the purpose of what we're trying to do. And I think if people are bought in to that purpose, then they can understand their part in trying to achieve it. One of the things we talk about in the army is mission command. And what we say is that we define what has to be achieved, but we don't define how to achieve it. We give freedom. I was talking earlier on about enabling people to be creative. We give freedom to people to come up with some ideas, because there's no way that running a study into respiratory patients moving from the acute trust to the community, that I had any expertise in any of it. These were very experienced nurses in the community. These were very experienced people in the acute trust, and there was some bloke telling them that they could do it better. But what I was trying to engender was that view that we as a team could make this better for the patients. We're all here for the patients. And I didn't say we could save money. Now, one of the things that we did was become more efficient, but that wasn't the driver. Mm-hmm. And I was having a conversation just yesterday about overheads. It was something that just came up, and how organizations can sometimes end up focused on the wrong things. So if you imagine you've got a number of overheads in your organization, and you could save money 10%. In the health service, I remember when I submitted my budget for my division, the first thing that came back was, you've got to make a 4% saving. And the temptation is, right, slice off everything at 4%. And that's the way you make your saving. But if you look at trying to cut all your overheads, all you do is cut your ability. If you can stand back, and I think, again, this is a difference between management and leadership. If you can stand back and look at the purpose, and look at how you might wish to improve that output, whatever it is. In this case, it was that respiratory process. Then you can come up with a mission that people can buy into, but it needs to be genuine as well. One of the things that Dale Carnegie, in that book from whenever it is, 1950 something, How to Win Friends and Influence People, talks about showing a genuine interest. And someone else has talked about the fact that if you can fake that, then you're made. And my point is that it needs to be genuine. If you've come up with...
Well, I was going to say, can you fake a genuine interest by its inherent name and its nature? It has to be genuine.
people will see through you. Whereas my point was to try and come up with something that we wanted to do. And I wasn't trying to save money. The driver was not to save money. The driver was to improve the outcomes for respiratory patients. And I think that I could get the buy-in from the clinical staff, the medical staff, because that's what drives them. I didn't think to myself, what drives them and how can I get them to save money? My drive was to improve the output for patients. And I think if we think very carefully about the mission at the beginning of whatever we're trying to do, we can then get the buy-in, and we can get the creativity from other people. We can generate that energy. But you have to put the effort into that start point. I mean, I talk about, just as an example, about if the mission was to seize the hill, then you will go, okay, I need certain resources, certain troops to seize the hill. But if the mission is to hold the hill, or if the mission is to to bypass the hill, if the mission, just slightly changing the word in that mission creates a whole different mindset in the people that you're working with. So actually working out what we're going to go into that very first meeting in and say, this is what we're about to do, is critical. And that's where I think leaders earn their money, by having the opportunity to stand back, as you say, and say, what is it we're trying to achieve here? And have I captured that properly? And will it inspire people to do things?
Yeah, I mean, that clear setting of an objective. What is the end goal that we are working towards? And also the reframing of that goal in terms of, as you quite beautifully articulated there, the goal is really to ultimately help the most amount of patients. It isn't to save money. It isn't to, look at a balance sheet. It's to help the most amount of patients and make sure that they get the best access to the care that they need. And if you do that, then it fulfills the overarching mission, but also the purpose and the reason that we're all there in the first place. Is that potentially, do you think, the biggest lever that often we could pull on to move and facilitate change in an organization like the NHS, for example? I'd really be fascinated to hear some of your insights on where you think we can do more from a leadership perspective to enable that change and to enable people to deliver more value for patients.
Well, I talked about the ICBs, and I think one of the things that I've seen in the emergent ICB modus operandi is the fact that they are looking to integrate more organizations into that one structure. And I really do think that I think it's the air gaps because what happens in an organization is properly swept up is quite good. Although one can always argue that there's a difference between the medicine division and others, the surgery division, whatever. So there's still probably air gaps within an organization, but there's a structure around it that can address those. The challenge that we have in the health service is where there's these other organizations and there are air gaps. So I think that interlocking piece is really important. And I don't think we're quite there yet. And partly it's to do with maybe you can call it the authority. The person running the ICB isn't in charge of the acute trust, isn't in charge of the community organization. They still stand alone as organizations. And I think so that and for various reasons we've preserved that, and we think that's important. Whereas I would argue that being emphasizing the N, the national, in the National Health Service would be useful. When you deploy in an organization in the army, if you work in peacetime to a brigade, and then you as an organization might be stripped out of your brigade to work with another brigade. Well, you just sit down and you work with another brigade, and there's someone else in charge, but it's the brigade commander, whoever that happens to be. In the health service, there's a real protection of the fact that each organization it is autonomous. It can make its own decisions, notwithstanding National Health Service guidelines, NICE guidelines and everything. So there's elements that people, particular tablet medicine, whatever it is, and we have to use it in this way. So we'll do that. But you can't tell us how to organize our organization or how to finance this or so I think allowing a bit of authority, releasing some of that authority to a higher body is one way of making this work. But the other way is this business of leadership enabling creativity. most of the good ideas in an organization will come from the people who do the work, who are involved in the output, who in their conversation amongst themselves will be using the why don't they do this, or why do we waste money there, where the organization at the top don't even know that they're wasting money there, or don't even know that it would be a different way to do it. I remember going around the wards, and we introduced a small change. Was that in each ward there's a little stall, and there's a whole host of stuff in there that's used in the ward, disposable stuff, gloves and bits and pieces, and all sorts of things. And what we did was, we, on the shelves in each of these wards, we put the price of those things. Because what would happen is, you'd walk in and you'd grab some. And we when I got there, they were telling me how they'd hugely improved the system, such that the accounting, if the shelf was reduced, then they automatically ordered the replacement. So if you grabbed 2 instead of 1, the system would replace 2. And that was seen as very effective. And it is, in as much as, what was the mission? Make sure you don't run out of whatever was in that ward. But actually, what it also encouraged, and I do talk about this quite often, the sort of unintended consequences of things, which is where I think leaders need to be able to try and step back and go, this is important, but that's the unintended. We need to try and think about how it might impact.
I think, yeah, and I think that's one of the crucial elements, as you say, of leadership, where the non-myopic view of something, where you're so focused in the detail, is really important. You need to be able to consider all options and all consequences and all impacts that might affect, like dominoes going down the line.
Absolutely. And I think, so we put the prices on simply, not because there was the ward wasn't charged, there wasn't, there was no transaction, but what it meant was, when you went to grab something, and as you picked it up, you saw that it was £1 or £10 or 50. It didn't matter what it was. You went, gosh, should I take 2 of those? Now, I wasn't there for long enough with my study to determine whether that had an impact, but I was aware that from other studies that does have an impact. So my view was that even having people do that double take when they're in there going, do I need to take 2 and then just throw 2 away when I've only used 1? Or shall I leave them on there because they're quite expensive? So that was a small example of how things could be improved. I wish I did. I wish there was one thing. I think the big thing is that integration of the organization. And I think another thing is the business of being able to stand back and look at maybe doing things differently. One of the big things that the health service value is the experience that people have, the way that this is the way that we do things. And one of the things that I was talking about with contingency planning is going, well, what if that assumption's changed? What would we do? Would it work? How could it work? How could we enable it? How can we prevent it? I think that sort of thinking is useful to get people starting to think, actually, there is a different way of doing this. So even if we haven't worked out what that is, we might come to that by going through these various versions of contingency plans that say, let's just change the assumption here and then see whether it makes a difference.
See question 4.
Question 4.
And for the uninitiated, that means, do we have all of the relevant information, and has the situation changed?
Has the situation changed? I think, really, I've used it a couple of times since then, since my army time with people, the question 4 situation. But it's actually, it is a phrase that's used in the army, because we have a clear mission, we have a set of assumptions, we're getting on with something, and then we have to ask ourselves question 4: has the situation changed? Where I'm coming from is, before we get to that point, we should ask ourselves the question: what if the situation changed? What if this thing didn't happen or that thing didn't happen? Sometimes it's worth, in those contingency planning, often a contingency plan is what if it went wrong? And where I was coming from is, well, what if it went differently? Sometimes people think that a contingency plan is because the right plan isn't happening. And often, if you've been doing the things for a long time, and in the health service, lots of things have been done a long time, then you go, that's the right way. So we only need to change if we aren't able to do it the right way. And where I'm coming from is, sometimes contingency planning can say, what if we did it differently? Not better, although it might be, but and it goes back to that business of having that purpose, getting that purpose right. So not what if we did it more cost effectively, because everybody's going to go, oh, I'm not interested in that. But actually, what if we did it differently? Would we be able to deliver better outcomes for patients? So yeah, that's one of the things we could do.
I think that's absolutely fantastic. So with that, Colonel Bob, how do we climb a 12-foot wall?
Yeah, it's fascinating that I had that as the title, because when I was going through the process, I was coming up with sort of dull 10 leadership lessons or the like. Somebody was encouraging me, you've got to have leadership in bold at the top of the title so that people, if they look up a leadership book, will find it, because nobody types in how to climb a 12-foot wall if they're interested in leadership. Well, not yet, they don't. But the whole point of that story was that on the assault course, there is one obstacle that you can't get over on your own. And that's how you climb a 12-foot wall. You climb a 12-foot wall with your team. And the team will help you get over that obstacle. And my sense is that there are 12-foot walls in all sorts of different sectors, different challenges in our working life, in our home life. And sometimes those 12-foot walls can't be climbed. We can't get over those obstacles on our own. We need our team to help us. And I think it should have been lesson 1. It's sort of lesson 3 in my book, but teamwork is the big thing that I keep talking about. The Army has just run a program for across the whole Army, where they encouraged all different organizations, units, regiments, whatever, to get together and talk about what they refer to as op teamwork. And they did a sort of like a study day. And I just thought to myself, this is what I learned throughout my time there. And it's the collective benefit that's greater, the sum of the parts. And trying to get the best from each member of your team is what leaders try and do. So how do you climb a 12-foot wall? With the help of others.
I think that's fantastic, and what a wonderful note to wrap things up on. Colonel Bob, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, sir. If people want to find out more, where can they go?
Yeah, well, I've got a little website, 12footwall.com, where I sort of explain a bit about my background and where the book comes from. You can buy the book from there. I'll sign them up and write something on it. And if you're minded to, there's an example of talks that I've done recently on the website. I come and do talks as well. So if people are interested, I can do that as well.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. I think right from the get-go, the value of teamwork, communication, collaboration, And the lessons that you've imparted with your book is absolutely key for all continued success in any manner of organizations. And I highly encourage everyone to check those out.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled that you enjoyed it.